Hello, everyone. Thank you guys for coming. My name is Sunny Aggarwal. I will be giving a talk today called Mesh Security. A little bit about me for anyone who doesn't know. I work on a project called Osmosis, which is a interchain DEX built primarily, using the Cosmos stack and in the Cosmos ecosystem. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit less about Osmosis, more about the Cosmos ecosystem as a whole and this idea of how we are bringing shared security into Cosmos and how it differs from the models that you see in most of the other blockchain ecosystems today. So, so what is Cosmos? Cosmos is this network of many interoperating chains. Each of them have their own sovereignty. They have their own validator set. And then there's a standardized protocol called IBC that allows tokens, data, smart contract calls, anything to go between them. But the most important thing to note about the Cosmos ecosystem, as you can tell from that diagram, is there is no center to the ecosystem, right? It is very much this mesh style system of there's point-to-point connections between every chain. There's no such thing as a single settlement layer in our system. Rather, every chain is the settlement for its own native tokens and its own native state, which we will come back to. So before we continue talking about blockchains, I want to take a little bit of a detour and talk a little bit about political theory. I'm sure everyone has probably seen some version of this meme before, the authoritarian, the political compass system. And I saw this meme on Twitter 3 years ago that's always stuck with me for a really long time, which it was basically taking network topologies and overlaying it onto the political compass. And so you have authoritarian, you have your authoritarian versus libertarian axis, depending on how hierarchical the system is, and then you have the left-right axis being sort of how equal different nodes are, or whether you have more power laws taking place in the right-based systems. And so this begs the question: okay, how do we want our network topologies in blockchains to be organized? And so in Cosmos, we call ourselves, the tagline of Cosmos is we call ourselves the Internet of Blockchains. And part of it is we actually did take a lot of inspiration from the architecture design of the internet as it was developed. And one of my favorite quotes from David Clark, one of the early internet pioneers, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code, right? If you're rejecting kings and presidents, what we're trying to build is we can't be building these hierarchical systems, right? We want to be building network topologies that are, fundamentally distributed in nature, right? And so, these green systems seem very nice and enticing. We've, built, and we have systems. How do you make these green systems work? You need these things called consensus protocols. And we've built many different types of consensus protocols. We have BFT consensus protocols Tendermint or Casper and stuff, right? You also have political green consensus protocols like democracy. The thing with these consensus protocols, while great, they don't scale infinitely, right? You need point-to-point connection to make these things work. That's why Tendermint is a relatively complex protocol. It doesn't scale to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of nodes, but it scales to thousands of nodes pretty well. Democracy, right? This is a picture from Opernzollern, one of the Swiss cantons, where they do real live open air democracy. But that's true direct democracy because you do have a synchronous communication medium for n-squared communication, and that synchronous communication medium is line of sight. But obviously, this doesn't scale as systems grow, right? And so what we've done so far in blockchains today is we've built many green systems. Each of these are called blockchains. They all have their own internal consensus systems. And now the question that faces us is what is the meta topology of these systems going to look like, right? How are these systems going to interact with each other? So one option that is where I see most of the rest of the blockchain ecosystems going towards is building these very hub and spoke style systems where you have a single chain that acts as the settlement layer, the source of security for the entire system, and then everything else is these like rollups or L2s or subnets or parachains or whatever word you want to call them, right? You fundamentally have this like system where there's all security emanates from one place. And I don't know, I just personally see this as fundamentally creating a very like top-down hierarchical system at this meta topology layer. This is not how the internet was designed, and I don't think this is how the interchain should be designed either. Yeah, now you have people going for like these L3s, like, okay, bringing in even more hierarchy. My take is, we very much have to be building, even at the meta topology level, we need to be building these either green or yellow systems, right? Green systems, maybe they'll work. We've had ideas of how can you run meta consensus protocols, like you can run a consensus protocol between blockchains themselves. So I think that is a direction that is possible. But I think what is most natural, what is probably going to end up happening, is we're going to move towards this world of like a yellow style system. And as I mentioned, this is basically what we've done in Cosmos today, right? We have this yellow-ish network of like, all these chains are talking to each other in their own mesh system. Not all chains are connected to every other chain. Some chains are far more connected than others, the ones that have more economic activity and stuff, but you let the power laws of the system naturally decide how these connections form. But okay, so now coming back, we have this question again of how is the security in the system going to work? Because today, every single one of these Cosmos chains has its own validator set, its own proof of stake system, and our security is much more fragmented. So how are we going to solve this? So let's look at we're going to think here mostly about economic security. We'll talk about fraud proof, validity proof stuff later down the road. But when we come to economic security, I'm going to use this sort of diagram as a key. Basically, we have, if you have this hexagon, that means a blockchain. A circle inside of it is the validator set, and the line means that validator set validates that blockchain. So today, what do we have? We have these sovereign blockchains. Let's say you have a chain like Osmosis. You have another chain called Axelar. They both have their own token. Osmosis has Osmo as its staking token. Axelar has Axel as its staking token. Cool. Then we can move towards a world where, I'm going to skip this one, where you can get this sort of sharded replicated security, right? Where what you can say is, hey, a subset of a larger validator set can be validating another chain. That chain doesn't need its own validator set, right? And so this is sort of what EigenLayer is building right now on Ethereum, right? It's saying hey, we're going to use this restaking system and say a subset of the ETH validators can choose to restake and help secure this another system, whether it's a rollup or a DA system or some Oracle protocol or whatever it is, right? You have this subset system, which is cool. Inevitably, I think this is not going to, the incentives of this aren't going to fully work out, and really what's going to end up happening is all these projects are going to want to have their own tokens as well, because incentives. And so really, you can imagine something like Osmosis still tapping in to something like EigenLayer. So while we have our own Osmo token used for proof of stake, we can augment our security with ETH restaking. So now basically you can come in and you can either stake Osmo directly, or you could restake ETH to help secure the Osmosis chain. And so, I do imagine that this is, in the current trajectory, this is how we're going to start to see a lot of the economic security in the Ethereum ecosystem playing out, where you're going to have projects, chains that have their own native token plus ETH restaking to help secure it. This is kind of, if anyone follows the Avalanche ecosystem, this is kind of very similar to the direction that they're going as well. But at the end of the day, I still see this as a fundamentally red system where you still have most of the security emanating from one place. There's centralized points of failure here. And it's this very, I call it the empire model of blockchains, where everyone is subservient to, the one, you have the empire, the core, and then you have the periphery, right? And everything else is this periphery. What we want to build towards is this world that we live in today, called of nation states and city states, right? Where it's okay, so as you can probably tell, I really like my political analogy. So when I look at this, it's like, okay, how does security work in the real world today between countries? The greatest security alliance in the world today is probably the NATO alliance, right? And the NATO alliance is interesting because it is not this empire and colony system. Rather, it is an alliance between mutual, like, 30 countries, or I don't know the exact number, but like 20, 30 countries where it's an equal alliance where they all basically agree that, hey, if any one of us is attacked, the others rush to each other's defense. But what's important is they all still maintain their own sovereignty. They all have their own militaries. They all have their own like governance systems, their own. And what they're getting by joining this alliance is they're getting the sum of all of their military capacities to help defend any one of them, right? And so it's basically this network of similar such alliances that have been built up throughout the world that have basically kept the relative peace over the last 180 years. Like on a relative scale of humanity, we've been in a pretty good peaceful time. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is how the relationship between economic interdependence and like military security dependence, right? Where like out of I think only 4 EU countries are not part of NATO, and that shows that like okay, look, there's like a lot of within the European Union, the amount of economic interdependence leads people to want to have this sort of military or security interdependence, right? Where these things are very tied, and so this goes very well with something in blockchains as well, right? Like let's say you take 2 chains that today are very sovereign, Osmosis and Axelar. Osmosis is a DEX. We use Axelar as our primary bridge for bridging assets from the EVM ecosystems onto Osmosis. And today Osmosis makes up, I think, like 70% of Axelar's like usage. So we're obviously one of their biggest customers. Meanwhile, this is a little bit outdated. Like 4 out of the top 5 pools on Osmosis are via bridged assets from Axelar. There's clearly high levels of economic interdependence between these 2 chains. And it would suck really bad for either of us if the other got attacked, right? And so this is why the natural model that I imagine arising is this idea of mesh security, where you're going to have bilateral restaking between blockchains. So the Osmosis chain will say, hey, you can use Osmo to stake on Osmosis, but we'll also allow restaked Axel to help secure the Osmosis chain. Meanwhile, the same will happen to the Axelar chain. Axelar chain will allow Axel to secure it, but it'll also allow restaked Osmo. And when the incentives play out, basically you're going to end up in a world where almost all staked Osmo is going to be restaking on Axelar, and all Axel is going to be restaking on Osmosis. And you basically get a system where both chains have the sum of their economic securities together. And, let's say you add in a 3rd chain into the mix, right? Mars is a lending app chain being built on Cosmos. And so, okay, now you're going to have the sum of all 3 chains as security system. Then keep in mind what's interesting here, it is like a bilateral treaty. So this is one thing that makes it slightly different than NATO, because NATO is more of like a green system where it is like a multilateral thing, while this is a network of bilateral treaties, and you let the mesh play out and see how security systems grow. What's really cool about this mesh security framework that we're building is it can be plugged into other things can be plugged into it as well. So something like EigenLayer can be plugged in to the mesh security system. So we're working with a team called Union to basically build this connection where you can use restaked ETH to help secure Cosmos chains as well, in the same way that you can use Cosmos restaked assets as well. And then there's a project called Babylon, which is building restaking for Bitcoin. So, okay, great. Now we're going to allow restaked, well, I guess it's not restaked because Bitcoin's not staked in the first place, but you'll allow staked Bitcoin, restaked ETH, and restaked Cosmos assets to all secure all of these Cosmos chains. So restaking itself, I think most people here, if you're familiar with EigenLayer, it's a pretty familiar concept, but I'm just going to go through it really quick. It's basically this idea that when you stake, Amelia, when she stakes her Osmo, what is she doing? She's basically opting herself into a slashing condition. So she's saying, hey, I'm delegating these tokens to the Figment validator, and if the Figment validator does anything malicious, I want my tokens to be slashed. With restaking, all it means is you are basically opting yourself into additional slashing conditions. So it actually works a little bit differently than Eigenlayer, where Eigenlayer, they're very much dependent on these like staking derivatives, and you stake the staking derivatives. We think that kind of adds like unnecessary risk, like kind of forcing people into using staking derivatives. We've actually built this as a core primitive into our staking module, where you can basically take any staked asset and opt yourself into more slashing conditions. So you can Amelia can basically say, hey, on the Cosmos Hub blockchain, I also want to be slashed if the Figment validator does anything malicious. And you can also, but you don't even have to be for the same validator, right? You can say, hey, I want to be slashed if the notional, sorry, I don't know why that's there. That must be a bug. I want to be like slashed if the notional validator does anything malicious as well. And so basically, let's say anyone does something malicious on a different chain, her Osmo will get slashed. One of the important things about building these systems core into the protocol is you can have your chain actually be smarter. There's all these concerns right now about how much are we over leveraging the stake that's like being used with Eigenlayer, right? By building this into the protocol, you can have your chain like make decisions such as, let's say I'm getting let's say something like Osmosis is allowing atoms to be restaked on the Osmosis chain. We can say, hey, we never want more than 10% of our chain's voting power to come from restaked atoms. So what will happen is atoms will keep getting staked, the voting power made up by atoms will keep going up, but at some point it hits some cap, and even as more atoms gets restaked, that's fine, but it's not going to let the consensus voting power of that restaked atoms ever increase past 10%. You can also have this happen from the consumer side as well, where you can say, hey, our chain is going to be able to detect, Osmo is being restaked. We're going to decrease your voting power for your Osmo on our chain slightly because we know that restaked Osmo is not worth as much to our chain security as non-restaked Osmo because there's not additional liens on this. So basically, by building these restaking protocols core into blockchains rather than externally, you can allow the blockchains to have more opinions on how to weigh the value of restaking and how it affects its own native security. Okay, so versus rollups. This is kind of going in a slightly different direction. So far I've talked mostly about economic security. This is more talking about all right, let's go into it. So what is an L1 and L2, right? So what is a blockchain as a whole? It's basically these three levels, right? You have execution, settlement, and data availability. And I think it's actually slightly wrong. I think the order, that's the typical order you see it in. I think it really should go execution, data availability, settlement, because that's the order that things happen. You execute something, then you prove data availability, and then you settle once you prove data availability to the settlement system. So today, the model of the world is very much this idea of L1s and L2s, where you have settlement on the L1, execution on the L2. You have an asset like ETH, you flow it onto the L2, you do things on it. However, you have this issue of what about assets that originate on the L2? What does it mean for them to settle on an L1? Because without the environment of the execution environment, the assets themselves are not meaningful. Imagine you had an LP share for a token that for Uniswap on Optimism. That LP share is meaningless to you on the settlement chain because without the rest of the execution system, it doesn't really do anything, right? And so really this world, what we're actually going towards is this idea that every chain is an L1 for its internal state and an L2 to its foreign state. So, I think I'm running out of time. So what I recommend for this stuff is go check out this blog post from DBA. It's basically about this idea that all L2s are actually just bridging protocols with fraud proofs. And, this is kind of the world that Cosmos kind of sees as well. So I'm going to leave it there. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
I was wondering, with all this restaking
Yeah.
sort of derivatives and stuff, where do you see staking rewards going?
Mm.
Because obviously what mostly drives crypto is economics.
Yeah, so what will happen is that it'll be up to a chain to say, hey, okay, something like osmosis, we're going to say, oh, we want to allow Axel to be restaked on our chain. And then we have to provide some mechanism of like, we would have to divert a portion of osmosis's staking rewards or revenues or whatever to that restaked Axel, right? So there's some claim that we're making that, oh, there's some, we're getting a certain amount of benefit from allowing that Axel to be restaked. But what's going to happen is, like, at the same time, the Axelar chain is also going to divert a portion of its revenues and staking rewards to restaked Osmo. So it's basically going to be these like bilateral agreements where at the end of the day, I actually think the actual APRs for people is not actually going to change, because whatever slightly decreased Osmo rewards you're getting, you're going to get made up for by restaking of Axel. But this incentive system is going to push everyone to restaking everywhere, and that's how we get this like basically the sum. Both chains are going to be secured by the sum of the two market caps.
So if I understand correct, people who would not restake would be sort of slashed.
They would be getting slightly lower rewards. Yeah. Yes.
I think there was.
So if that's the conclusion, if everybody has to restake on every protocol, and we're increasing the computational overhead of all the validators, are we just recreating Solana?
No, because that's kind of what I was trying to get across here. So what we actually do is restaking is not done at the validator level. It's done at the staker level, and it's up to a staker. So in Cosmos, we have like this notion of delegation very natively into the protocol, where you have validators and you have delegators, and the delegators choose validators to delegate stake to. And the key here is you don't have to restake to the same validator on every chain. If you had to do that, then yes, that would not be cool, because now it's going to benefit only the few validators that have the capacity to run validators for hundreds of chains. They're going to get all the delegation. But instead here, we can be like, oh, I want to delegate to Figment here, but they're not running on this other chain. I'm not like incentivized to remove from Figment on my first chain. I can just choose, I'm going to restake my current stake to a different validator that I do like on this other chain. So you have to remove, we remove validators from the equation. The restaking decisions are done by stakers. Another thing to note is it doesn't have to only be for like consensus protocols and for like blockchains themselves. You can build restaking for all sorts of things, right? Like Oracle protocols, DA systems, or fraud-proof style systems. Anything you want. The way we've implemented mesh security, it's this like interface that you can plug in arbitrary, we call them slasher contracts. So the first contract we've written is a Tendermint fraud-proof system, but we can write further slasher contracts where you can say like, oh, if I restaked on this Oracle provider and their Oracle price is like this much divergent from all these other Oracle providers, like, okay, they're gonna get slashed as well. So you can use this restaking for all sorts of things.
So let's talk about economics for a second, because I noticed you went on that a little bit. How do we value another chain's stake on a different chain? So like if the value of a stake decreases dramatically or increases dramatically, the voting power that stake holds should change, right? So how do you actually value that? Because I feel like on every different chain, the price of Ethereum or the price of wrapped Bitcoin is different.
Yeah. So this we've left as a decision up to the chain that's So we call this so we call these like provider and consumer. So in this case, we'd call the Osmosis the consumer chain and Ethereum the provider chain, because it's a restaking of ETH on Osmosis. How to value restaked ETH relative to native Osmos stake is a decision up to the governance system of the Osmosis chain. So the way that we would do it on Osmosis is we're a DEX. We're just going to use the TWAP prices from our DEX, right? And so one thing is we actually do have something very similar to this whole system already in Osmosis today. It's called mesh security, and it's called superfluid staking. And what that does is we allow you to use LP shares from our DEX in our proof of stake protocol. So we can say, like, we actually today, you can say, hey, I'm going to take my Osmo ETH LP share and stake it. And by what we have to do is we do have to make certain risk assumptions about ETH. And so we provide a discount factor on it. We say that, oh, we're only going to use 50% of the economic value of this Osmo ETH LP share in the proof of stake system. And so you usually will provide a significant discount on the economic value. So let's say it's a 50% discount. And then you can choose like how it's okay. You don't need to be like perfect on like what the economic value is. It's not like, that's why taking like a really slow TWAP, that's like a 1 week long TWAP or something, as long as you're making this assumption that like, hey, the price of this asset is not gonna change more than 50% relative to your native token in whatever your TWAP period is. And then we also have all those other like security systems in place as well. Be like, oh, this asset cannot make up more than 20% of our economic security or anything like that. You can if your chain doesn't have a DEX on it, doesn't have your own TWAPs, you can do things like, one, Osmosis provides TWAPs over IBC to all the other Cosmos chains today. But the other thing you can do is you can use things like validator provided price oracles, which is another module we wrote where you can basically have the validators of your chain provide like on-chain price oracles that you can use as the weighting system.
Okay, thank you. We need to finish now to have time for another talk. If
Thank
you
you.
have more questions to the speaker, you can grab him afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you.